I think is like the secret sauce in Próspera, that we want to develop a system that is not entirely different. So we're still operating under the same standards. We're still using common law. We still use regulation, right? And like third party enforcement of these regulations if something goes wrong. But we just have a different mechanisms how we sort out the good regulations from the bad in ways which doesn't happen in the current system.
Hi, I'm Jared Hope, co-founder of Logos, a fully decentralized, privacy-preserving, and politically neutral tech stack. Today, we're talking with Niklas Anzinger, founder and CEO of Vitalia City and founder of Infinita VC. Thanks for joining me, Niklas.
Fantastic to be here, Jared.
So I wanted to chat with you because, I mean, you've been coming up on the network state scene and making some waves on that front. But I had the pleasure of visiting Vitalia City in Próspera recently. I'm still on the island of Roatán as we're recording this.
Oh, you are right now. Very
yeah,
cool.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
gonna be back on Monday.
Oh, cool. Well, yeah, if you're around, love to catch up in face to face. But yeah, I was just super impressed with what you're doing there. And so I wanted to know a bit more and get other people to, spread the word, so to speak.
Sure. What was your impression? What can you see physically, or what surprised you?
The first thing that surprised me actually was the entrance into Pristine Bay and Próspera, right? Like the security, I believe, is got a new detail there, and they're a lot more thorough. So that was super. That was the most surprising initial impression. But then once you come up the hill, you see this Bitcoin center, which is inspiring to see. And then you come over and you see this wonderful valley of like green, lush gardens and beautiful buildings. So
a bit of a utopian vibe, right?
right, absolutely. And then just getting to going to the Vitalia Dome and seeing all these amazing talks and visiting the Beta building and Duna. It was incredible to see that. I think you're taking how much occupancy of the Duna building will be for Vitalia?
So about 40-50% maybe.
Yeah, right. So yeah, really exciting times. So I'd like to, but before we get into like what Vitalia is, biotechnology and Infinita, I kind of want to know a little bit more about your life story and like how did you get to this point where you're on an island in the middle of the Caribbean?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I'm originally from Germany, so I lived and grew up in a town close to Munich, a city close to Munich called Freising, which is the next city to the airport. And for long parts of my life, up until about 2.5 years ago, I felt that kind of my intellectual interests and sort of my entrepreneurial endeavors were a bit disconnected, not fully, but I was always into the world of ideas. I spent the first half of my career in like economics, philosophy, international relations. I was in Washington, D.C. think tanks and management consulting. So I found all that like very inspiring and I learned a lot from it. And I had really good professors and a really good education in like analytical philosophy. And economics is definitely something that's now stuck with me. But I always felt it was a bit disconnected. So what do I do with it, right? So it doesn't impact anyone whether or not I'm right on these ideas. Right. So, people for decades wrote about like free banking and stuff like that, but nobody cares, right? Because nobody's going to listen to, or like, let's reform the Fed or something like that. This is not how things work until the Bitcoin white paper came around, right?
Right.
So I was attracted to technology and entrepreneurship, right? It wasn't then the Bitcoin white paper, but I was already quite attracted to that space, but I wasn't yet into technology or startups. When I was only 26, I joined like a really cool startup based in Berlin. So I really got the hang of entrepreneurship. I became an operator. I led teams. I developed new products that later raised to Series B. So I felt like I learned the ropes of entrepreneurship. And I was ready at that point after 5 years to start my own journey. But I still couldn't find like, where does my thinking, I want to, see the world go better in many different ways. With what can I do practically, right? So I was in the days when COVID started, I was looking into healthcare and everything that's broken with it. And my conclusion was, even if you have the best, AI for drug development or like open source access to all the medical data in the world, we still have one big bottleneck, which is the FDA and medical regulations all over the world. right, which have become progressively worse, right? And same as with money and with Bitcoin, we know why that is. Like there's economists who've been written about that for decades, and we know what we would need to do to change things. But the FDA or Congress and politicians just don't care, right? You can reform these existing large incumbent monopoly institutions. The only thing you could do, or what you can do in the private market, when you face like a big incumbent player or a monopoly like an IBM, is to start a new startup, right? But that doesn't really work for these political institutions, right? Or so I thought, until I found Próspera, which is exactly that, right? So it is building a city in the protocol, basically, for building a city, right? So the legal and governance system. Right. So it's a common law based legal system. And the idea is once you get land somewhere, and especially economic zone with legal autonomy, then you can build an environment there that's fosters entrepreneurship. Right. So think of a Singapore in a box, like the conditions that made Singapore, Dubai successful. You basically take the software of that, and then you get land and legal autonomy and rights. And then you get the next Dubai, the next Singapore. So that's what we're building. That's what Próspera is building with its first iteration. And I saw that 2 years ago, and I just believed in it. I was like, this team is credible. It's great. It was like a group of Honduran reformers that started it like more than 10 years ago, and a team of Latin American entrepreneurs, most of them, and also some Americans that supported it. So it was like a group of people that were super aligned with this space of ideas and like really capable to execute it. They've really figured things out on the legal and governance side. So I became very bullish on the Próspera regulatory system and how it could like fundamentally solve all these problems that we have in these areas of technology that are stagnating, like healthcare and biotech and hard tech and much of like crypto and financial. When I say stagnating, I mean relative to what we could do, right? We're still progressing in many areas, but we could do it much, much faster.
Yeah.
So that's what compelled me to start Infinita, a fund that was looking into these startup sectors that could really benefit from that regulatory advantage, some of which were already there. And it turned out that longevity and biotech became the most promising vertical for many different reasons, right? So we had like one really successful startup here, Minicircle, which is on the best way to produce a blockbuster therapy, follistatin gene therapy. Second, it was something that's very scalable, right? So there's more than 1 million tourists here coming each year. We could build a medical tourism hub. Doing research clinical trials, you can do a couple of dozens of them within one clinic, right? So we could do much, much more of that. So each successive startup after Minicircle can basically follow the same protocol, and we optimize that. So that was a big reason. Second, nobody else is doing it, right? So we have basically a monopoly once we succeed here. Third, there was a strong pull effect from the longevity community because they realized they need to do something different, because in the existing institutions, they're not succeeding, right? Because aging is not considered a disease by the FDA. So they're cut off of a lot of the funding. So
just like at that point, like just to clarify, right? Like, you're seeing these longevitists that are actually hitting the same walls. And so they are a market for Vitalia and taking advantage of this regulatory arbitrage. But and I know why that is the case, but I was wondering if you could articulate, why you think this is the case in our existing political systems.
The case that
that
there's
and sure. We have to create a different zone in the first place.
Yeah. So just to put you a bit in a real situation, these are people I keep talking to. They're like the best or leading scientists in their field, right? They have a novel therapy, something that's actually very well proven over decades. It's just really like the use case that it's not proven for. And they have like high net worth individuals that want like their life saved. And they're like, why? And then they're like, okay, I now need to prove that this technology, that I'm like the best person in the world to know about this, to other people that don't know about it for 10 years, so I can save that person's life. That's kind of that's kind of weird, but that's happening on a massive scale, right? And hundreds of millions of people's lives could be saved if that wasn't the case, if there was a better system, where it wouldn't take 10 years until you're like allowed to save someone's life. But of course, we want to prevent the bad stuff, get much of the good stuff. But the system is really over optimized for preventing the bad stuff. Right. So, of course, you prevent the bad stuff. The child is safe if you put it in a cage. So it can't like run around. But the better way to treat the child to be like a thriving being is if you educate it on dangers. Right. And if you allow it to, or if you allow a market of different players to provide different kinds of guardrails that work better for different people and different use cases, rather than having like one monolithic organization. And there's like a very specific analysis you can make about the incentive that an organization like that faces, right? So the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, they're basically an agency that says yes or no to new drugs or therapies. Right. So you need to do a lot of research to prove to them that you should be able to bring this to the market. Right. So let's start there. Okay. Everyone's like, sure, that sounds good. We want someone to ensure these things are safe and effective. Right. Who are you to do? You do not want like safe and effective drugs. It's like, yes, I want safe and effective drugs. Right. I'm just doubting that this is the right way to get it. And just to throw some data points in, like before 1962, now it takes 10 years to prove a drug. Before 1962, it took 6 months. Right. Wow. Because that was a limit by Congress on the FDA, how long they could track for drug approvals. Right. And it wasn't like medical anarchy then. Like, in fact, it was a golden age of medical innovation. Right. Almost all the big pharma companies were born before that time. Right. We had penicillin, we had the vaccines, we had the eradication of infectious diseases. And the trend of acceleratingly longer health and lifespans was before 1962, right? So how much safer and effective did it get us? There's actually no proof it got us safer and effective drugs. Right? There really isn't.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, what was the event in 1962 that led, Congress to change that, or, for the dynamics to change, and, expand the bureaucracy and like the clinical trials and then the entire process around that?
Thalidomide. So thalidomide was a drug that was used by pregnant mothers, and it had side effects on their pregnancies, which led to babies born with deformities.
Right.
So it's like an extremely visceral case of a public health disaster. Right. It's exactly what you don't want to happen. It's like a very specific story that led to it. But it didn't happen in the United States, by the way. But the FDA fortunately had a good regulator. Someone was like, we should not allow this. Right. And then they said, all right, we need to make extra sure that can't happen here, even though it didn't even happen in the United States. Right. So that's when typically politicians come to the forefront and say, I'm going to do everything to make this like safer or whatever. The only thing they typically do is make new laws. Right. So it's rather rare that they say, okay, we're going to like remove laws, right? Or we're going to make these laws kind of slimmer or easier or something like that. It's always like new laws that make things like stricter, because that has like widespread public appeal, even though if you look at it from like an expert or technical point of view, that might not necessarily be the solution. Right. So comparable examples like 9/11. Right. So we need to make airplanes.
Don't get me started on 9/11. Yeah.
Exactly. So we had the Patriot Act, and we had like a crazy amount of airport security as a result. And how necessary is it like that you put out your laptop, or like, you can't take liquids with you below 150 milliliters. Like, all that stuff is really pointless. But that's actually how these regulatory agencies work in almost any industry. Right. There's only one way, which is up, which is more regulations. Because, the politicians and the staffers of the regulator, they want to expand their office, right? The way they get like promotions, the way they can pay people more, or the way they get more positions is expansion, right? So they don't make a profit, right? So they don't have an incentive to reduce costs in any way. That would mean cutting positions.
Yeah.
So there is a logic to bureaucracies expanding that you see throughout with all these agencies. And the FDA is basically an example of probably the most powerful public agency in the world at an advanced stage in their life cycle, right? So they've been around for a long time, and they regulate like 40 or more % of US consumer products, right? Wow. And when it comes to medical, they regulate more than 50% of the world market when it comes to drugs and therapies, right? Because other regulators in other countries are actually even worse than the FDA in many ways, right? So other countries have things like price controls on drugs, which means there's no incentive to innovate on drugs and therapies in other markets or develop them there, right? So the FDA almost has something close to a global monopoly. So either that, so the regulators or the politicians in other countries do it even worse, or the FDA goes to other countries and says, this is the gold standard, you should do it too. And then these countries have these like very extensive regulations, but they're very much understaffed to implement them. Right. And then if you're like an entrepreneur in like a Latin American country like Chile or Argentina, like the regulation sits in some health ministry. And you're like, so what do I do? Who do I talk? And there's no one really you can talk to. But, you know, if you don't do what you're supposed to be doing, but you don't know what you're supposed, then they can still shut you down if you do something wrong or like imprison or fine you. So that is
the cost of innovation, right, in this industry, right?
Yeah. So that is really a disastrous state for biomedical innovation all over the world. And that is despite the amazing science and technology we have. Right. So when you look at the science news, there's a very real sense, and that's true, that there is a lot of progress. Right. We've decoded the human genome, the language of life. Right. So we can directly alter the, we can directly like edit the language of life through things like CRISPR, mRNA, genetic, and there's different kinds of genetic engineering we can do. That field is progressing rapidly. But at the same time, we're still stuck with that bottleneck. Right. And if we can remove that, we're going to experience a Cambrian explosion of innovation in biotech.
So, okay. Well, let's assume that, we do have a new regulatory environment in where this these startups in biotechnology and regenerative therapies can thrive, right? Vitalia City. I guess there must be some criticisms to that idea or concerns, especially if there's been like these issues in the past. Like, how can we speed up the process and avoid those kinds of issues at the same time?
Yeah. So it's a very good question. It's a very practical question, right? Because we're an innovator in that space. We do something different, and we're pretty much the only ones. Right. So that puts us really into a position where all eyes are on us. Mm-hmm. Right. So any mistake or if there's like a person that gets hurt or even dies, that will be amplified 1,000 times, even though it happens all the times in the existing systems. Right. In the existing systems, you still do clinical trials and, trials on volunteers that take a risk in their lives. So in principle, what we're doing here, we want to build it in a way that it can become a global standard. Right. So that's the answer. Right. So we want to do things in a way where we do have the protocols that make sense. Right. So the FDA, the problem is much less the actual safety protocols they want. It's much more the bureaucratic incentives and administration of them. That's the problem. Right. But the FDA and the medical establishment, has real experts that, know the stuff, and they have good safety protocols that we're following and that are reasonable to follow. Right. So we're following them to the highest degree possible, in which it makes sense, and in which we can also explain to someone, like, how do you do this in a way that makes sense? Right. So whenever I explain to people the idea of like the common law, and that it's much more focused on, the harms done. Right. So was there something like fraud or crime rather than the prescriptive regulations? That just makes a lot of sense to people, right? It is also how many legal systems around the world already work. So England, UK, and the United States are traditionally common law-based countries, even though it's largely also superseded now by administrative law. But there's places like Dubai, for example, which operate under common law, and it's generally seen as very business-friendly, and it works, right? That plus the idea that insurance is in the position of being a regulator. Mm-hmm. Right. So the idea is, all right, let's not have these legislatures, politicians be the regulator, because they're not experts. Right. And, so that means they have to ask experts. And as a result, what we have is lobbying. Right. So what if instead we say the insurers are the regulators? right? So there's a competitive market for insurers. So you as a business, you can adopt your own regulation that you think fits for you, but you have to get regulatory insurance, right? And then you go to the insurance provider, and the insurance provider, they don't want to underregulate you, right? Otherwise they'd have to pay, but they also don't want to overregulate you, right? Because otherwise they have unreasonably high compliance costs. So they would want to find the right sort of balance between risk and innovation, right? So that I think is like the secret sauce in Próspera, that we want to develop a system that is not entirely different. So we're still operating under the same standards. We're still using common law. We still use regulation, right? And like third-party enforcement of these regulations if something goes wrong. But we just have a different mechanisms how we sort out the good regulations from the bad in ways which doesn't happen in the current system.
Yeah, I mean, like I remember first reading that idea of like insurance as like, you know, a regulatory mechanism in like I think Milton Friedman's Machinery of Freedom, right? And when Eric Bryman, and Próspera implemented that idea, it was amazing to see that someone's actually trying that in the real world, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how that plays out. And I think, you know, the other thing is, you know, for an industry like, you know, medicine, you know, reputation is really important. And so if there is not only if there is a death or some kind of claim against insurance that's like almost catastrophic, you've entirely ruined your business at that point, right? Like it's so the incentives are at least aligned in a way where I think this could potentially work, which is super exciting to see. I think like what was before I came here, I thought what you were doing was almost too futuristic, right? Like actually implementing these things. But I was surprised to find out that there were real companies there. There were real therapies being offered, and in the process of happening. I don't know if you can speak to any of the therapies that are being offered today, or like, and what's coming down the pipeline. Like, what's going to be available for a medical tourist who comes to Vitalia?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the point of credibility, so we've been fortunate that, or with Próspera, that they've been able to partner with the Garm Clinic, which is a clinic that was here before, and they're have like a very reputed head physician who was also heading the U.S. Olympic Committee before, right? So, and that Dr. Hauser has an IRB, right? So they're authorized to do clinical trials and collect data in an FDA compliant way, right? So that's reputation and credibility as a starting point is very helpful, right? And sort of we're gradually building out that credibility. During Vitalia, we had some of the best scientists in the world here in longevity and in biotech. We're inviting even former FDA regulators to advise you on these to advise us on these things, right? And what's available now, or the first kind of blockbuster therapy, is the Minicircle follistatin gene therapy, right? So there have been a couple hundred people visiting the island already to get it and to do clinical trials. Bryan Johnson has been here twice. The first time he got the therapy, the second time he got it to his dad during Vitalia, right? So, and then there's a couple of other therapies in the pipeline, more gene therapies for like treatment of hair loss and skin rejuvenation by a company called Unlimited Bio. There's other startups who do genetic engineering. And there's one who does like 3D bioprinting of like organ tissue and materials for like transplants. And there's a really cool company called Symbiont, which is doing human augmentation, right? So it's implanting things like chips into your body, which is actually a very interesting use case, right? Because that industry has been existing in the United States for a while, but really under the regulation of like body art, like piercing and tattoos, right? So
I nearly did that myself. Yeah,
exactly. So it's kind of cool. But the reason is that they can't really graduate to medical use cases because then they're regulated by the FDA. And like any new industries really starts with the hobbyists and tinkerers, right? So, you know, imagine software had to cross a chasm where they would have to pay hundreds of millions to deploy like the first like operating system or something like that. It just would be not possible to really grow up from like that stage of like the hobbyists and tinkerers to a serious industry if just to get one product in the market, you'd have to pay hundreds of millions, right? That doesn't work. But here we can really take someone who's like a leader in that industry and make it easier and cheaper to graduate cybernetics and implants to medical use cases. So, for example, more precise measuring of biomarkers and things like that. So I think that is very promising, sort of as a hub to build that out.
Yeah, fascinating. I would probably I've kind of gone on a bit of a journey around like the specific, embedding of chips, at least, right? Like I love the idea of, cybernetics and, how this can, help support us in terms of like, tracking our biometrics and improving our health. And there was a time where like I was really excited by the promise of like injecting one of these little RFID pills that you could then write, a certain amount of data on. For me, like the dream at the time was to implement like a private key that I could then use to sign transactions with, right? There's some limitations around that, but certainly overcoming. I guess like today I have more concerns around totalitarian governments and digital ID and like how that might be used against me in the future. So that's ultimately why I didn't get it, but the general premise, I think, is really fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, and you said something interesting before, right? So that it might be too futuristic.
Right.
Right. There's actually some like a real trade-off that we're dealing with, right? Because on the one hand, we want to make all that stuff happen. On the other hand, like anything that's like too far out there or controversial, like was always inviting like critics and hit pieces and all of that, right? So what I do think is important to recognize for Vitalia and for Próspera is to not like go to the most like radical or new things, right? So that's not necessarily even the best use case. The best use case is actually stuff that we know works, right? But still would have to go through the entire pipeline, right? So especially because the model is you have to approve every different use case, which just doesn't make sense, for example, in the case of gene therapies, right? So in the case of gene therapies, what matters or what influences the risk profile is the viral vector, basically the way you get it into the human body. So, right? So once that is approved, that basically is the risk profile, but it's not like in what like payload you're doing it or for what specific use case you're curing it. You could really address very specific things through gene therapy. So the current regulatory model just doesn't make sense. And there's a lot of stuff out there that we just know it's safe, because the risk profile is basically proven because one use case was approved, or we know that one use case works, but we'd have to have other use cases approved, which doesn't make sense. So this is actually really the most interesting thing to do here, right? Because you don't need to prove out that it's safe, right? You already know it's safe. These are the most interesting things to develop here to get them to market faster, right? So
yeah, I was surprised. That was like it was the biggest learning that I think I took away from Vitalia City. There was a bunch of like a wealth of data on all of these different therapies from countries all over the world that basically shown its safety profile in some way. They've existed for a while. And it's just a matter of, bringing those to market and kind of reducing some of the barriers or hurdles to actually getting it there, which is fantastic,
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the most interesting use case. I mean, we all want to do the really cool futuristic stuff, right? But as you also often learn as an entrepreneur, you want to solve a real problem. Right? And sometimes there's a faster, more direct way, or you can build on things that already exist to solve that problem. Right? You don't need to use the fanciest new technology or whatever, right? So it's just, right, how can you save many people's life or make them live longer with what we already know works? There's a lot out there. And just one thing to mention, I think my prediction was if it's really just us in Vitalia here in Próspera, then we will just get more conservative over time, right? So, and just because, well, we have an incentive to go more into that sort of proven, safe, but high impact stuff, right? So if people do too much of then we might get like more regulatory right? So that's why we need a multitude of new locations. Yeah, that's why we need a multitude of new locations, right? Because we just see how human incentives work here too, right? So with Vitalia, we want to have different locations. Próspera wants to have different locations. And there just should be many more startup city builders who are like, okay, assume to provide competition.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of what I love about the competitive governance idea, right? Is that you're actually creating you're treating governance as a service, and quote unquote citizens as customers, and you kind of invert the entire issue on a system of incentives. I don't know if you have like any places in mind, for the next Vitalia sites, or if Próspera has any particular sites in mind. Like, where would they be on the world, and why?
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me that the last couple of years, and I've been talking to Patrick Friedman about this, also in my podcast, who's been in this industry for like almost 2 decades. And he said he's never seen like this abundance of potential partners in the form of jurisdictions and governments. Like in Latin America, even within the United States, even in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. So I'm personally most bullish on Africa and Latin America, but I hear like new potential partnerships in jurisdictions all over the world, like regularly. And Patrick sees even more of that. And he said there's never been more potential locations, and many of which in like really beautiful places. So I think that's not really, yeah.
That's interesting. Like, I mean, I wonder if you have any thoughts or ideas of what's driving that abundance, because it suggests that, like, host nation states are willing to do more experimentation, right?
Yeah, I think maybe COVID was really a perfect storm. I mean, it really got me to do things differently, and I found so many people that were just realizing the institutional decay in the places they lived in. And in fact, there's apparently this one book that's saying that pandemics have often caused major disruptions in history when it comes to governance. Yeah, so that's an interesting piece.
What's the book? Do you recall the title at all?
No, I don't recall it. I wish I could recall who.
We'll find it later.
Yeah. But I think that could have been really a perfect storm. I mean, generally, governments are kind of schizophrenic, right? On the one hand, they treat their own people like cattle and try to squeeze as much out of them as they can. But they're typically very friendly to like internationals if they bring like business or money, right? So they're trying to, the perfect example of that is Portugal, right? So Portugal has really high taxes on their own citizens, and had for a while really low taxes for foreigners and very generous investments and visa programs, right? So I don't think that's the ideal social fabric necessarily, but it shows you a bit the schizophrenic nature of government. So there's always really been a market by governments to get like these investment programs and things like that. There's tons of countries where you can buy passports, and tons of like nations where you can do like offshore companies and things like that. I think all of these things are fine, right? But I think where we really need to go is make this into a larger market, right? So it's not only like the most wealthy that can sort of have access to these options, right? So what I'm really passionate about is creating these opportunity zones to bring the opportunities directly to the people that need it most, right? So the ones in like developing nations that don't have access to even the most basic like financial infrastructure, secure property rights, and things like that.
Yeah, and this is where I definitely align with you a lot, and I'd like to get to that in a second. But like you touched upon this idea of expanding the sort of market in general, and I know you've thought about this in the past, and obviously biotechnology is the one that you're the field that you're kind of using network states and specialized zones to come into fruition. But what other kind of industries or can we create that you think are the most promising for these SEZs or network states to kind of get involved with?
Yeah, sure. I have a whole list on my blog, like I think 30 network state ideas or something like that. So I thought definitely about many different areas. So first off, financial, right? So especially insurance, I think there could be more competition. There's a couple of interesting domiciles, but they're not very digital, right? So, and I think especially with crypto, it would be interesting to use sort of liquid insurance pools, right? So from like a Uniswap or whatever. So that could be interesting. And insurance is an enormously important industry in terms of capital formation. Same with crypto and tokenization of real world assets. right? So I think people in the industry seem to be a bit jaded in crypto because it's like everyone's dream to put real world assets on crypto, but it doesn't work. And the main reason in my superficial analysis is jurisdictional. It's just that jurisdictions in the real world just don't accept it. That like that NFT represents an entry in like a property title registry or whatever. Right. So that's a big one. Even like in many countries, it's really very basic things like functioning electricity and internet, right? That can already get like talent clusters growing, right? So I think thinking about education and talent can get a lot of output, right? So get like the smartest people from a region to a place where they can be most productive. And it's really just these basic things. Like in places like Africa, I think Itana is doing that to a large extent. It's a startup city in Nigeria, right? So just a basically campus where you get like the smartest people, tech entrepreneurs in an environment where they don't have all the hassle, where they have institutions where they can incorporate a company and things like that. I mean, I'm personally very passionate about hard tech in general. So things like energy. These are kind of harder to scale, right? Because energy really needs large markets. But you can think about things in creative ways, right? So, nuclear fission would be the more interesting use case. Nuclear fusion is not there yet. And once it will be, it might not even be the biggest regulatory problem. But much of energy in Africa is really the problem of like state-owned national monopolies, right? So if you can even have like economic zones that are like solar parks and things like that, or wind parks that are able to provide these things privately.
Yeah, South Africa is a great example of that, right? And I think the AfriForum actually developed out their own solar field or solar farm, but then the government came down and shut the whole thing down, and so they have to endure these rolling blackouts every day, which is just kills all small and medium enterprises because they can't operate without energy, right? So it's super fundamental to get these basic infrastructures in place. I guess like okay, cool. And I guess like on the opportunities for for people who could really benefit from this, and you're identifying in Africa, which absolutely is the case. I want to kind of like touch on your most recent blog article where you were talking, about the evolution of network state building, and then showing like these two major branches, as I understood it, right? One is, jurisdiction first, and the other one is like community building first. I'm very curious to hear a bit more of your thoughts around that, and like, why are these the two dominant branches? Which one do you favor? And do you see any other forms of this coming out in the future? And how does that then apply to something like, Africa?
Sure. So for a bit of context, so many people are kind of hearing about this, what's happening in the space for the first time through Balaji's book, The Network State. Right. So, and the first intuition is that it's like another online thing. But Balaji is actually explicitly talking about like new, like micronations, seasteading, charter cities, and doing things in the real world. Right. And he's basically following up on a history where that happened. Right. So, the Seasteading Institute has been pioneering these things, and micronations have existed for a longer amount of time. And jurisdictional innovation is nothing new, right? Estonia providing the e-residency program and things like that. Charter Cities, Paul Romer, 2009, is something that has inspired a couple of projects. And what was kind of the model that came out of that is the jurisdiction first model, right? So jurisdiction first is that you start with like government negotiations, making a lot of legal contracts, then you get some land, and then you build infrastructure there, and then you want people to come, right? So, which is great, but there's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem, right? So without that infrastructure, people won't come, right? So, but without people, it's not very economical, or it's hard to plan for what infrastructure you need to meet that demand, just from a company building, capital efficiency point of view, right? So you're kind of taking a big bet and a lot of risk with a lot of upfront capital requirements. So Próspera or Roatán or Sidam or Roatán basically have that first. And Balaji's book, The Network State, is basically an iteration on that and suggesting a new strategy. So it's flipping the model on its head. It's saying, why don't we go like demand first, community first? We go with these highly aligned online communities that like meet in the cloud and then have them like crowdfund territory and sort of materialize or spawn up in the real world. So that I think I would roughly associate with projects like Afropolitan or Praxis, which develop these highly aligned online communities that much of it is actually gathering together in the real world. And then they're talking to governments and getting land or territory, right? So my take on it is, I think it's overlooking a bit. So it's not solving the challenge, right? So the first model, yes, there's a point, but these projects are successful, right? So Próspera, Ciudad Morazán especially, is doing really well in terms of like iterating around users or customer needs. Right? Ciudad Morazán is a charter city on mainland Honduras whose main customer is Honduran blue-collar workers. And they do a fantastic job, and they're very capital efficient, right? So, but still, the idea is valuable. Maybe you can iterate faster, and it's even cheaper to start a new startup. But then the challenge for projects that start with community first is, what if the government negotiation takes like longer than you thought? Like that could take years longer, right? And it's very difficult to sustain that excitement and momentum with a movement like that because like a real place brings stickiness, right? It is really a flag in the ground, and it creates permanence, right? So this, I think, is easier for these online communities and movements to fizzle out, which is not a reason against them, right? So the idea is that you can just do many more startups to the starting line that do this. But my thinking is there's actually a way to overcome that problem, right? So to start, because my analysis is, as a startup, you need to get your highest strength you develop in the areas you need to survive, right? So for places like Próspera, that's legal and government contracts and things like that. For like Afropolitan and Praxis, that's community building. But you don't get strong in other things that you need later down the road, right? So you need to develop a strategy where you need to get good at both from the beginning, or both are kind of part of what you're doing. And that's where the pop-up city model comes in, right? So with the pop-up city model, like Vitalik Buterin did this experiment in Montenegro where he brought like hundreds of people together from the Ethereum community and aligned frontier technology communities like SynBio, Longevity, and things like that. And it led to a real feeling of, hey, I have like the density of like a San Francisco in terms of the people I want to hang out with, right? And it is in a location where you can like talk to the local government. In Montenegro, that was actually the new prime minister we talked to. And like, hey, can we stay? And can we get like a special economic zone, right? And kind of this forces you to do both things at the same time. You need the community to succeed, and you need to talk to a jurisdiction to allow you to be there, right? And you can like sprint that process, right? So you can show the host government, especially at the time now where you have the abundance of jurisdictions, hey, do you want this here? We need to get these things done fast, right? So here is like the different laws we need. We have the templates for that now, right? So this is just a way to sprint the entire process. So that's what we did with Vitalia, basically, right? So we basically now a physical and an online community that has spent a lot of time together in the real world and has access to and has a deal with an existing jurisdiction, right? And I think that is something that network state projects or startup societies should gravitate towards, right? Because it's also cheap, right? It's kind of an MVP. We did our pop-up city basically with 200K in loss. We could have done it without a loss even. There's models to do that.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. I mean, I definitely think like, the online community first is difficult to maintain the enthusiasm and, the hype, let's say, right? Especially when you're dealing with long lead times in, signing contracts with governments and actually, getting territory. And then certainly the, real property development that you have to do for people to even exist, in the space that you have. And, if you get all of that done, then like, you're at this point where it's almost like a build it and then they'll come kind of environment where you now can start onboarding people and there's something real and tangible that they can participate in. And the pop-up city, whether it's Edge City or Zuzalu and all of these sort of forks, Vitalia, I think started similarly, right? Like,
I'd say we're all forks of Zuzalu.
Right. I think they're all great. Like, they're a great environment to be in, right? Because you are around like-minded people, and it's a really surreal experience. Because most of my life, most of the people around me do not have the same interests as I do, right? I've actually been thinking about it in slightly different ways, or another potential approach. So I want to throw it your way and see how you think about it. I definitely come from the internet first side of the camp, right? Like, this is like Tim May, libertaria in cyberspace. Where he was like identifying, seasteading. He was identifying like special zones, and was concerned about some of the physical implications. But that sort of cypherpunk movement saw creating jurisdictions in cyberspace being a potential reality, and that's kind of how I view Bitcoin and Ethereum in some ways, right? They are these jurisdictions that do manage, like, they have a very defined border, what's on chain and what's off chain, and they maintain their autonomy. But like, the issue with that is only internet first, right? And like, there are challenges, as you've highlighted, in terms of like getting real assets on chain, represented on chain, and more importantly, legitimately done so. I think where I've been kind of challenged with is like, okay, well, the cost of like setting up a jurisdiction is doable, but it requires significant amount of time. Building out an online community is also quite difficult. So for the time being, with like say Logos in particular, I've only been focusing on strengthening the jurisdiction that's in cyberspace. But what I want to do is connect that to how political organizations tend to work, right? And when I say that, I'm talking about like, say, party organizations or machine politics, like political machines. And the reason why I highlight political machines is because they did what's a form of what's called like clientelism. And so they actually just did local government, helping the people on the ground where they're at. And the reason they do that is so they can create loyal voters, so they can then, have a large voting base to take government jobs and govern in that particular region, if not further. So whether it's a city, a state, or a borough, so on. I think there's a lot of ideas around that are actually really applicable. And the reason I think that is kind of similar to how, cul-de-sac or city DAO or cabin, that they're kind of creating this sort of like pop-up semi-permanent villages. But like, immigrants have been doing this in cities for ages. They've been setting up ethnoburbs or, ethnic enclaves within, a few blocks of a city that they'll come in and like they'll buy like certain but properties. And ultimately, once they get a density of people similar to a pop-up community, right, like Zuzalu, they start having their own institutions, right, and own ways to interact. So I'm wondering, like, where I'm going with this is like, well, maybe that might be another potential path where like you find high trafficked crypto hotspots, maybe like Berlin, for example. You start trying to get property within a certain region, and then get like the laundromats and like the convenience stores and so on to accept crypto. But at the same time, you're helping people in that community with like real problems. And instead of getting them to vote per se, you're getting them to use the crypto token or tokenized asset. So, and this kind of goes to an idea how I view tokens or coins as like communities of belief, and like buying into a coin or a token is like a vote in a sense. So that, and then this is something that kind of enters the real world, does real good for, people potentially. I mean, I don't know if it will, but it's, hypothetically is the case, on the ground, while being able to entrench this sort of jurisdictional networky state order in a place, and then create like systems of insurance, of arbitration and governing services and so on. I don't know if you see any issues with that, or I don't know how you think about those ideas.
Yeah, so it's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's in fact part of what many of these multi-jurisdictional network states projects are doing, right? So I just think it's the physical part is relatively undervalued, right? Because that's just where governments are much more present and are blocking progress. Right. So in the cyberspace, the pace of innovation has been very fast and very rapid. Right. But I think really many of the bottlenecks are translating that into the physical world. Right. So governance is basically virtual. It's rules, right? It's incentives, institutions, but enforced in the real world. Right. So much of the outcome, for example, putting someone in prison or, giving someone a drug or a therapy are all done in the physical world. We're all existing in meat space, right? So many of the endpoints of things are in the real world, right? So the virtual world makes all that much more efficient and effective, right? So, but if we don't control these endpoints, I think we won't realize these visions in a more complete way, right? And I think this is really where the innovation has been lagging, right? Simply because
definitely
these regulatory institutions and jurisdictions that tell you can't do this and you can't do that in the real world, right? So the insurance part or the tokenization part, that's like, if you do like this in your hub in Berlin, like you can't, right? So you're not allowed to, right? Because you need to register like in that jurisdiction, whatever you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see that challenge. I guess the thing that kind of maybe gives me a glimmer of hope was the Jewish diaspora had these structures called kagals or kahilas. I'm definitely mispronouncing that. But these were effectively like states within a state, right? Like they didn't have their own nation at the time. And so this is how they ended up amassing some kind of political power and being able to keep their community together and do their own kind of forms of institutions and laws. So I think like it's definitely I think there's some parts of that, elements of that can work. It's definitely not without its challenges, and will definitely be faced in the real world. And I absolutely agree that where we've been lagging is how crypto or how these technologies actually innovate in the real world, and we haven't gotten there yet.
There's like hundreds of different pathways we need to take, right? There's not just one.
Yeah,
and
definitely cool. So I guess like I don't have we're kind of running out of time, but I'm very curious like if there's anything you would like to tell the audience, where to go, where to see your stuff, obviously your podcasts, your blog, that sort of thing. Please let them know.
Sure. Yeah. Vitalia.city. Right. So we're open all year. We're just announced another summer program in July, and there's like 3 sub-conferences. So for short-term and long-term visits. So check out our website where you find that quite easily. So we all live together in that one Duna Tower on a tropical paradise where you're in right now. So highly encourage your listeners to check it out and to build stuff with us. I also will say this is not only like for biotech founders. In fact, our distribution is about 50-50. So 50% biotech, the other something else, right? So there's a lot of like AI, crypto, hardware, healthcare stuff that we also need to build on this mission to make death optional, right? So from things like incentives, insurance for healthcare and things like that. So if you feel what you're doing is aligned with that mission we're on and longevity, then you're more than welcome there. Or if you're generally like a longevity enthusiast, we're going to also focus more on healthy living and stuff like that. So check it out and visit us.
Awesome. Thanks. And I guess if anyone's more interested in these topics, is there any recommended reads or books that you would like to throw their way?
Yeah, so strandedtechnologies.com, my blog and podcast,
Yeah.
right? So you see a lot of the authors there that have influenced my journey. So J. Stores Hall, Where's My Flying Car, for example, or Eli Dorado, a hard tech influencer who's a venture partner with my fund Infinita. So, or Patrick Friedman himself, one of the OGs in the startup city space. So, or Ton W. Bell on the legal system. So there's loads of content there to get started on this journey.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on, Jared.